All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name's Victoria Riekers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the sexual violence response coordinators at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual Domestic Violence. And today's webinar is serving LGBTQ plus survivors of sexual violence. And it's a part one today. It's a 3-hour training, but we broke it up into 2-hour-and-a-half sections. Because we know you all get Zoom fatigue, I get Zoom fatigue, and we're kind of tired of that, right? So we broke it up into 2 parts. Today's part's going to be focused on LGBTQ identities and terms. So we will go ahead and get started. So before we really dive into it, just a little bit of housekeeping. So there is Spanish interpretation. Hay interpretación en español hoy. If you need Spanish interpretation, please select the Spanish channel. At the bottom or top of your screen, it's a little globe, and you can click on that, select Spanish, and then you should be able to hear the Spanish interpretation. So si necesita español, puedes elegir el canal español para escuchar. And then if you're having audio difficulties and you're listening in English, you can choose the English channel. Sometimes this solves that problem. We have ASL interpreters with us today, so they should be visible on your screen. So I'd love to see in the chat, if you can see our ASL interpreters, but there's 2 of them on the screen, please let us know in the chat. One has their video on and the other's video is off right now, and it just says a big L. Awesome. It looks like y'all can see. Some people are saying you can see only one. That's because one of them has their camera on, but the other, it will probably just look like a big L. Perfect. Great. It looks like they're working. And it sounds like you can also hear me as well, since you're all responding in the chat. So that's great. Yeah, so only one is visible right now because only one has their camera on, but the other one you should be able to see their icon, and it's just a big L. But once they turn their camera on, because they'll switch off interpreting, then you should be able to see the other. If you need to get in touch with me, or if you need technological support, please send us a message to all panelists. And then Marley is here. And she can help you with any tech support issues or any administrative questions that you might have. Also, just so that you all know, if you message all the panelists, it's not private. So all of the interpreters will be able to see that message. So if you want to speak to someone privately, please just message all panelists and say, I'd like to speak to Marley, please. And then Marley can respond to you privately, and then you can have a private conversation if you need to. Today, because it looks like we have over 100 people today, so the chat might get a little bit unruly. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. That should be another function on your screen. Put them in the Q&A box instead of the chat. That way, when I'm training, I won't miss any questions that people have. We'll still use the chat for different engagement questions, things like that. But if you have questions specifically for me, please put them in the Q&A. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of Zoom bombing. This is when someone's being harassing in the chat or something like that. We won't be tolerating that. And so if that happens, we will be removing folks from the training today. We don't expect that to happen, but just in case, we are prepared to do that. And then lastly, I'm sure you're curious about your evaluation and certificate. So at the end of each day, there will be a survey about the training. Once you complete the survey, you'll be able to download your certificate, and you'll also be able to download the slides from the day's training. So if you only attend the first day, you'll only get a certificate for the first day. If you attend the second day, but not the first day, you'll only get a certificate for the second day and not the first day. And so that should be pretty straightforward. If you have any questions about certificates or the survey, please reach out to Marley in the chat. Okay, and then so I just want to quickly go over our objectives for today, just in case you have any concerns about what will be in the training today. So today, we are just reviewing LGBTQ terminology and identities. It's going to be pretty 101, so going over different terminology that you may or may not be familiar with for the community. And then part 2 is going to be reviewing barriers for LGBTQ survivors and best practices for service providers. And so if you want to skip the first part because you feel super comfortable with LGBT terminology already, that's fine. You can come back tomorrow to talk about the best practices. You can also stay if you want, because sometimes we might feel that we know a lot of different things about different communities, and then we still might learn something new. I always like to stay because I always learn something new, but it's up to you. I'm seeing a question asking if this will be recorded. Yes, this is being recorded. So we will be posting it to our YouTube video, our YouTube channel. The survey and the certificate won't be available if you only watch the recorded version. Yeah, and so like I said, if you have questions about the certificate, you can reach out to Marley, but really quickly, to get the certificate, all you need to do is complete the survey at the end of the training. Once you finish the survey, there will be a link to the certificate. So this is a little bit new if you've come to our webinars before. We're trying a little new method, but it should be a lot easier than it was before. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get started with today's training about LGBT terminology and identities. So we have a Mentimeter poll for you today. So this will require you to get out your phone or open another browser in your community. You'll go to menti.com, and then you're going to enter in the code that will be on the screen shortly. And then there'll be some questions for you to answer. Okay. So the first question is, what identities do you bring to today's training? So you'll just go to menti.com and use the code 182720. And then you just type it in. It's anonymous, so don't worry about that. And then if you're struggling with the question, some identities that you bring to today's training, it's really whatever you want. If I were answering this question, I might say, I'm a sister, I'm a bisexual woman, I'm a white woman, I'm an advocate, some different things like that. Awesome. Thank you all for responding to the question. This is just to help me get a better idea of who's attending today, so that I can hopefully better tailor it to you all. And I think it's nice to ground ourselves in our identities when we're talking about a topic that can be very personal to our identities. Lots of advocates today, which is great. I love training advocates. I'm seeing a couple LGBT folks as well. Yeah, lots of different identities today. So thank you all for responding to this. Okay, so what's our next question? So I also want you to answer this question. So who in your life is LGBTQ? So this could be yourself, a friend, a relative, etc. So clients, best friend, a battle buddy, myself, a relative, many friends, child. I'm seeing none. Yeah. Coworkers, lots of coworkers I'm seeing on here. Social media friends. Awesome. Neighbors, nephews. Yeah. So the reason I asked this question is because sometimes I think we can kind of live in our own little bubble, our own little, our own little bubble. And sometimes we don't always realize how many people in a different community from us or in the same community from as us that we know. And so I just like to draw attention to the fact that probably all of us know someone who's LGBTQ. I know some people put none on here, and that's okay. It's possible that you do know people who are LGBTQ and you just don't know that they're LGBTQ, right? That's definitely a possibility, but I know it's a lot more common than it used to be that we also now know some of the folks in our life who are LGBTQ and some who aren't, right? And so I like to kind of ground us in that before we really get started. I'm going to move on to the next question. How comfortable do you feel with LGBTQ terms? And so there's 4 options: very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, very uncomfortable, and I think somewhat uncomfortable. Awesome. Thank you all for responding to this. So I'm seeing it looks like maybe about a quarter of you all are in that somewhat uncomfortable, very uncomfortable range. A good chunk are somewhat comfortable, and there's another good chunk that's very comfortable. So that's great. And so I'm hoping after today's training that we'll all be more in that somewhat comfortable. It's probably going to take some time to move from very uncomfortable to very comfortable, right? But hopefully by the end we'll be more comfortable. This training is really designed, especially today, is really designed for those folks who are somewhat uncomfortable or very uncomfortable. So we will be really digging into what some of these different terms mean and how they're used and try to make a little bit more sense. Because sometimes if we're not a member of the community, it can almost feel like a different language sometimes, right? And like I am a member of the LGBT community and I'm always learning new terms as well. So it's totally understandable that some folks might be uncomfortable with these terms. Okay, and then this last question is a short answer question. So you can just type in one answer or a couple short answers. What concerns do you have about LGBTQ identities or terms? No concerns? Great. If you have any burning questions that you've never heard an answer to, you could put that there. Not offending anyone, people being anti-bisexual, yeah. Using the wrong term accidentally while interacting with a client, absolutely. I definitely understand the feeling of not wanting to make a mistake when we're a little bit outside of our comfort zone. So I'm hoping this training will help with that as well. I don't know when to use terms appropriately, that folks will be disrespectful, but I don't know what they all mean. Different uses within the LGBTQ community, want to be sensitive and accurate. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of folks talking about being concerned about using the wrong term or not offending anyone. Yeah, and I will say, I don't know if that's going to go away because we're all human and we're all going to make mistakes. right? And so we are going to talk a little bit about what to do if we do make a mistake and how to handle that situation. But be prepared that you will make mistakes and terms change, and it can be difficult sometimes to keep up with those changes. And so we also want to practice how to respond when we make mistakes, right? I also do want to say, I know some folks had some concerns about people not respecting identities in today's training. So yeah, I want to emphasize that let's try to be as respectful as possible of the other folks in the chat today and the the interpreters and anyone like that. But I also do want to make sure that folks feel comfortable to ask questions and that this is a space where you can ask questions that you have not heard the answer to before, or maybe you're embarrassed to ask the question. In the Q&A, I believe you should be able to ask questions anonymously too. So if you have concerns about that, that should be available. So awesome. Thank you all for responding to this. Okay, so that's our last question right now. We're going to come back to the Mentimeter, but that's our last question right now. So before we start getting into LGBT terms and identities, I also want us to be grounded in the topic of sexual violence today, because that's why we're here. We want to learn all of these terms and identity words so that we can better serve survivors, specifically LGBTQ survivors of sexual violence. So at the Coalition, if you've attended one of our trainings before on sexual violence, you've probably seen the slide before, but we talk about sexual violence as any type of unwanted sexual experience, right? Any type of sexual experience that does not involve consent. And this can be a variety of different things. So we talk about rape. And when we're talking about rape, oftentimes we're talking about if someone's body is penetrated by another person or an object. We also talk about stalking. So sometimes people will stalk to perpetrate sexual violence or to commit harm. We talk about sexual exploitation, which could also look like sex trafficking. It could be blackmailing someone into doing something sexual. We talk about non-contact unwanted sexual experiences. And so this is any unwanted sexual experience that does not involve physical contact. So this could involve forcing someone to watch pornography, or if someone is masturbated at, right, without consent. Sexual harassment, another broad term, but we often talk about this in the workplace or street harassment. We talk about being made to penetrate. So this is when someone is forced to penetrate someone else without consent, either with their own body or with an object. Unwanted sexual contact. Unwanted sexual contact is any type of physical sexual contact that does not involve consent. So this could be sexually kissing someone without consent, sexually touching someone. And then we also talk about sexual coercion. So sexual coercion we talk about as a perpetration tactic where someone is coerced into sexual violence through things like emotional manipulation, pressure, that sort of thing. So we start with this just because we all want to be on the same page about sexual violence and how it's a very, very broad range of experiences. And then I also quickly want to go through some statistics of how sexual violence affects the LGBT community. So 1 in 2, 50% of bisexual women and 1 in 8 lesbian women have experienced rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. And this statistic specifically defines rape as penetration. 3 in 4, so 75% of bisexual women, and 1 in 2, 50% of lesbian women have experienced sexual violence other than rape in their lifetime, right? So we see these numbers are incredibly, incredibly high. 1 in 2 bisexual men and 2 in 5 gay men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. When it comes to the trans community, 1 in 2 trans and gender nonconforming individuals, so again, 50% have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And just a note, when I'm talking about bisexual, gay, and lesbian, that can include trans folks, the statistics are not clear as to whether or not they did include trans folks. So that's why it's kind of separated out for these statistics. When we break down the number of trans folks who've experienced sexual violence, 55% of non-binary individuals, 37% of trans women, and 51% of trans men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And we can also probably assume that these numbers, all of them, are on the low range, right? They're probably underreported even in these anonymous surveys, right? So now we're going to get into what makes up our sexual and gender identities. And then we'll talk more about how we can serve survivors tomorrow. So one person said, would any unwanted kissing be considered sexual violence? Yeah, so I think that's a great question because sometimes it can be a little blurry where the line is with sexual violence. I would say if whoever experienced that unwanted kissing, if they feel like it's sexual violence, I would say, yes, it is sexual violence. But someone else might experience that and not feel like it's sexual violence. So that's a great question. So what makes up our sexual and gender identities? Okay, so some of you may have seen this before. This is the gender unicorn, and Marley is going to put a link to it in the chat. And I like to use this as a guide as we go through these identities today, because it's kind of like a good way to follow along. So we're going to go through everything on this handout here. And this handout's from the Trans Student Educational Resource, which is a great resource that I'll share at the end for you to refer back to. So first, I want to talk about binaries. So you can answer in the chat, what is a binary and what are some examples of binaries? So one example is black, white, man, woman, male, female. A binary is when there's only two options. Yes, thank you, that's perfect. One or the other. Yeah, only two options. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and today when we're thinking about binaries, we're probably thinking about man, woman, gay, straight, right? Those are some common binaries that we think of when we're talking about gender and sexuality. But there's other binaries, right? So I'm seeing tall, short, right, wrong, black, white, right? There's a lot of different binaries, and we tend to think in binaries, right? In US culture, we have this idea that binaries are, they're just very common, right? In the way that we think about the world. And so I want to challenge everyone today to kind of let go of this binary framework, right? So we want to move from either or to both and as a framework. And I try to do this in every aspect of my life. But in particular today, we're talking about gender and sexual orientation. So we really want to be thinking about that today. So we want to kind of try to unlearn these binaries that we might have been taught from a very young age. So that we can really understand how other people look at the world and how other people experience the world. All right, so what is gender? So gender is a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but in our society, we often talk about gender in terms of gender roles, right? So you might have seen the slide before if you've come to some of our other trainings. We often will think about gender in these gender roles of male or female. And then we assign different traits or behaviors to those different groups, right? So we might say that men are aggressive, independent, strong, dominant, unemotional, sexual, right? And then in our society, it also says that women are the opposite, right? They're not aggressive, they're submissive, they're passive, they're emotional, they never think about sex. Right, and I'm sure all of you can name many, many different things that our society says about men and says about women, right? So oftentimes we think about gender in that way, but we also want to think about gender in other ways. So gender is also about how someone identifies. So a gender identity is one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or other genders, right? So your gender identity can be different things, right? We have these gender roles in our society, and there's this idea that there's only two genders, male or female, woman or man, but that's also just not true, right? We're going to go through a bunch of different gender identities today. And this is just all about how we feel on the inside of how we identify. I also want to make a note because language can sometimes be tricky. When we're talking, I have gender identity on the slide today, but when we're talking about gender identity, oftentimes people just say gender. And I want to encourage you all to also just say gender. I have gender identity on the slide for clarity because we're going to talk about gender identity, gender expression, other aspects of gender. But often what happens is sometimes we only think of gender identity when we're thinking of trans people or non-binary people, but we're really thinking of gender. And when we only say trans people and non-binary people have gender identity, that means we're othering them and we're not treating them the way we might treat cisgender people. And don't worry, I'm going to also explain what cisgender means on the next slide, or in a couple slides maybe. So you might also be thinking, wait, what about sex? How does sex play into this? So I'm seeing a couple questions come in too. So someone said othering them. So othering them is when we make someone who's different from us feel kind of outside of our group or external to us. So it's like we don't see them as like an equal, or we see them as this very, very different person than us. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so what about sex? So you might be thinking this at this point, right? We know when babies are born, the doctor will announce that they're a boy or they're a girl, right? I have the doctor diagnoses them, and this is because a coworker of mine used to say that, and I think it helps because it's sometimes the doctor misdiagnoses people, right? But when a baby's born and it's announced that they're a boy or a girl, this is called the sex assigned at birth. And some people also say the gender assigned at birth, right? And so this is really what they are perceived to be based on oftentimes their genitals. And then what happens is that these children are assumed that they have a gender identity that matches their sex assigned at birth. And that's also not true for everyone. For some people it is. So some people, the sex assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity, but for others it does not. So someone may identify as transgender if they identify as a gender other than what they were assigned at birth, right? So if someone was assigned male at birth, they grow up and they identify as a woman, then they might consider themselves trans or transgender. If someone is considered cisgender if their gender identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth, right? So if someone is born, the doctor says it's a girl, and that person grows up and identifies as a woman when they grow up, that person is cisgender, right? And so you might have heard terms like trans or cis before. So trans is just the shortened version of transgender, and cis is the shortened version of cisgender. And then I have this comic is from Assigned Male Comics. So this is a trans woman who makes comics. And she wrote, being trans doesn't mean I was born a different gender. It means I was mistaken for a different gender at birth than the one that I am. Some other terms that you might have seen the acronym AMAB or AFAB. So AMAB or AFAB. That just means assigned male at birth. And assigned female at birth, right? So that's referring to someone's sex or gender assigned at birth. Some other gender identities, or just some gender identities in general, are man and woman, right? Those are often what many folks will think of when they think of gender. But there's many other identities. So there's non-binary, and then I have in parentheses NB because that might be something you've seen. NB is an abbreviation of non-binary, and it's written out this way. Some people who are non-binary use that term, and some people who are non-binary do not use that term and they don't like it. So they might just prefer non-binary instead. I also have on the screen transmasculine, transfeminine, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, and two-spirit. So I'm trying to, I have a couple of these that I specify later on, but I don't specify genderqueer or gender fluid. Genderqueer and gender fluid are under the non-binary umbrella, right? As well as agender. All of these are under the non-binary umbrella, and they mean different things. Sometimes they mean different things to different people as well. But agender typically means someone who is without gender. Gender fluid typically means someone who is fluid between different genders. And genderqueer, sometimes I've seen it used as an alternative to non-binary. Other people have used it in different ways. And so sometimes these identities can be very personal as to their meaning. But what's important to keep in mind is that it's a non-binary gender. Okay, I see a question in the chat. Can you explain transsexual, transgender? Yeah, so I'm assuming you're asking about the difference between transsexual and transgender, or do you need a clear explanation of what transgender means in general? So I'll just review what transgender means in general, and then I'll explain the difference between transsexual and transgender. So transgender is someone who identifies with a gender different from the sex they were assigned at birth, right? So this means if someone was assigned male at birth and then they grow up and they identify as non-binary, they may consider themselves to be transgender. They may also consider themselves to be transgender if there's someone who's born female, they're assigned sex female at birth, and then they grow up and they identify as a man. They might identify as a trans man. I hope that is clarifying the difference between transsexual and transgender. So transsexual is an older term that previously was sometimes used interchangeably with the term transgender. It's no longer a term that's generally used. Some people may use it as their personal identity, but many trans people consider that term to be offensive. So I don't have transsexual on the PowerPoint because many trans people consider it to be offensive. But some people do identify with that term. Some people who identify with it will identify with it because they've undergone different forms of medical transition, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But others don't like the term at all, even if they've also gone through the same forms of medical transition. Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, so I'm going to break down some of these gender identities a little bit more. And that way you also have a copy of the definitions to take home with you. So non-binary is an umbrella term for all genders other than male, female, or woman, man. And this term includes genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, and many others. There's many different types of genders, and non-binary can be an umbrella term for many of them. Someone who's transmasculine. Transmasculine describes a trans or non-binary person whose gender is masculine or who expresses themselves in a masculine way. They may or may not identify as male, right? So they may identify as non-binary transmasculine. They may identify as transmasculine and as a trans man. It's going to depend on the person. Transfeminine is similar. So it describes a trans or non-binary person whose gender is feminine, or who expresses themselves in a feminine way. And they also may or may not identify with that binary gender of female. And then two-spirit refers to a variety of native or indigenous gender and sexual identities. All right, I'm seeing a couple questions. So if we have a women's support group, but we want to include other genders, not including cis men, what kind of language could we use for this? Currently, we just say non-cis men, but I don't love that because it centers men in a space where we are trying to center other genders. Yeah, that's a really great question. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about language, like how we can shift our language to be more inclusive. So if you don't mind, if you are planning to come tomorrow, I want to hold this question for tomorrow just so that we have time to cover the other stuff today. So I'm going to hold on to that question and answer it tomorrow. If you're not going to be here tomorrow, please send me an email and I can email you the answer. And then I'm seeing a couple people say that the link isn't working. So I think Marley's responding to that as well in the chat. Okay, so I want you to think, what do you do every day to tell people your gender? So let me know in the chat if you do anything to tell someone what your gender is. So one person said nothing. So maybe we've never thought about how we tell people our gender before. One person said makeup, wearing feminine clothing, nothing really. Our clothing choices. I think that's always a big one when I ask this question. Telling people you're a mother. Yeah. The hairstyle, using she, her pronouns, telling people my pronouns, being myself. Yeah. Lots of clothing's coming up. And I know sometimes if we've never thought about how we communicate our gender to other people before, sometimes we might think, oh, we don't really do anything. But you might realize that you have done some things to communicate your gender. So these photos that I'm going to show you are from like a quick Google search of like, what do women wear? Right. So dresses, right? A lot of you mentioned clothing, feminine clothing. So florals, flowy things, right? Jewelry, purses, the way we style our hair, right? What about body hair? So I know a lot of people who identify as women or on the feminine side of things, they may remove body hair, right? Shaving our legs, shaving our armpits, that sort of thing. I know a lot of folks mentioned makeup already. So that's another way some people communicate their gender. I also did a Google search of like, what do men wear? And so I got things like blazers and button-ups, facial hair, right? Beards, the way their hair is cut. I also was thinking about what are some nonverbal things that we do. So one thing that we think about is like men take up space and women take up less space. This man, actually this one came from, I asked a coworker how he communicated his gender and he said his tone of voice. And so when he's talking with men, he said that he tends to be louder and more kind of aggressive in his tone of voice. But when he's talking with his niece, he is much more gentle with his tone of voice. And then you may have heard the expression manspreading before, right? So this kind of plays into that nonverbal body language of like men potentially taking up more space and women taking up less space, right? So we see her legs are crossed in this photo. And so there's a lot of different things that we can do to communicate our gender. So with our appearance, our clothes, makeup, facial hair, body hair, what we're wearing, right? All of that stuff. And some of this is done unconsciously. Like we maybe have never thought about this before, or we've never thought that like this is like, we do this because this is what's expected of people who are feminine or people who are masculine, right? And so this is actually our gender expression, right? So gender expression is the physical manifestation of someone's gender identity through clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc. Right? So this is all the things that we do. But it's really, really important to keep in mind that gender expression is not the same as gender identity. right? So if we look at this photo of this person on this slide here, they are expressing themselves in a very feminine way, but we can't use that to assume what their gender identity is. I also have some celebrities on the screen here, right? And so this is another reason we can't assume someone's gender identity. So if we look here, you might recognize folks. So there's Ruby Rose. Ruby Rose identifies as non-binary, if you don't know this. And Ruby Rose uses she and they pronouns. Harry Styles is known to dress in a very feminine way. And Harry has never mentioned anything about their gender identity or expressed anything publicly. So we don't know how they identify. We have Amanda Steinberg here. Amanda played Rue in the Hunger Games. You might recognize them from there. And Amanda also identifies as non-binary and uses she and they pronouns. At the bottom of the screen, there's Ezra Miller, who also identifies as non-binary. And then we have Jaden Smith. Jaden Smith, similar to Harry Styles, is known for dressing in feminine ways and has also never made a statement about their gender identity. And then we also have Zayn and Gigi. They did a photo shoot with Vogue where they talked about how they like to use, I think they said non-binary fashion. And the non-binary community was very upset with them for kind of co-opting their gender identity into a fashion statement, right? And so they were dressing in a non-binary way and then talking about it for Vogue. But they do not identify as non-binary, right? So we can't make assumptions based on how someone looks. Some other terms to be aware of. One is gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is anxiety or discomfort regarding one's sex assigned at birth. And this image here is from BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed did an article where they asked different artists to submit what does gender dysphoria look like to them. And then this is the accompanying quote to the image this artist submitted. Dysphoria for me is feeling like a tangled mess. Everything is tangled and I feel disgusting in my skin. I hear the ringing in my ears, my head won't stop buzzing, and my face burns with embarrassment because of how round my face is, or because how short I am, or because my hips are wider than a boy's, right? And so it's feeling that discomfort with their sex assigned at birth. And so what are some ways that gender dysphoria may come up when we're serving sexual violence survivors who experience gender dysphoria? Feel free to answer that in the chat. Yeah, so the question is, how can gender dysphoria show up when we're working with a sexual violence survivor who experiences gender dysphoria? Yeah, so I'm seeing anxiety with the exam. Anxiety with the exam can absolutely be a way. So oftentimes when someone needs to get a forensic exam or a rape kit, right, as it's commonly known, the nurse may need to use anatomically correct, biologically correct words, and this can trigger someone's feeling of dysphoria. There may be issues with dysphoria because of who assaulted them, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, some of these things are coming in faster than I can read them. Someone said being forced to feel like a gender they don't identify with. Yeah, that can definitely trigger someone's dysphoria. Right, so this is something that I think it's important for us to be familiar with so that we're not accidentally triggering someone's dysphoria, or we're being very transparent about why we might be talking about things in a particular way, right? Like, it can be difficult for someone who experiences bottom dysphoria to go through the exam, yeah, like you said. Absolutely. Thank you for your answers, everyone. Okay, So actually, before I move on from gender dysphoria, there's another term I want to let you all know about, and it's called gender euphoria. So gender euphoria is when someone is being affirmed in their gender, or they're feeling seen in their gender, and they experience a sense of euphoria. So it's like the opposite of gender dysphoria. So there's some good things as well. Yeah, so someone asked, is gender dysphoria a form of trauma? Absolutely. Gender dysphoria can absolutely be a form of trauma. And so that's another way that trans and non-binary survivors may be re-traumatized through the experience of the services they get after sexual violence. Yeah, great question. And then someone also asked, is gender dysphoria diagnosed? And I actually, so I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, and I'm completely blanking on if this is something that can be diagnosed. I know there's a lot of things, there's a lot of issues when it comes to LGBT identities and being diagnosed, because sometimes they've been seen as mental illnesses. And so I don't talk about that in this training, and I don't actually know if this is something that can be diagnosed. I want to say no, but I think there is some diagnoses that are related that sometimes, depending on where you live, you may need for different parts of transition, if that's something that you want. So that brings me actually to the next slide. So we want to talk about transition a little bit. So transition is when someone goes through the process of developing or assuming a gender expression to match their gender identity, right? And transition can look different for everyone, and there's no one way to transition, right? But some common areas that people will transition in are social, legal, and medical or physical transition. So social transition is like coming out. So coming out as the gender you identify with. It's asking people to use different pronouns than you had previously used. And maybe it's changing your name. Maybe it is changing your clothes, right? That sort of thing. Legal transitioning is when maybe you change your, you legally change your name, right? So not just asking your friends and family and coworkers to change your name, but you legally change it on your legal documents. You change your gender marker on your legal documents. And then physical or medical transitioning is maybe you want to go through some different medication to that may help you feel better in your gender expression. So it could be hormone therapy, maybe surgery, different things like that. And then I'm seeing someone, someone answered that question for me. So it can be, the gender dysphoria can be diagnosed by a psychiatrist. And oftentimes you do need to have this diagnosis when you're going through medical transition, right? So yeah, there are different types of diagnoses. Someone may need to go through medical transition, but it really depends on the person and what exactly they're looking for. So thank you for that. But yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways that someone may transition. And some people may only choose to socially transition, and they may never choose to legally or physically transition or medically transition. Sometimes when cis people think about transition, it is very focused on that medical transition. And so I kind of want us to move away from thinking about transition as just this medical thing and just like surgeries that people may have, because there's a bunch of different ways transition can look. And when we're only focused on surgery, we tend to focus on genitals, which can be really disrespectful to a lot of trans people, right? Nobody wants to be asked about their genitals. Nobody wants that kind of invasion of their privacy. But I also think it's important as advocates and other people who serve sexual violence survivors to know about these different types of transition, because this could be an area that we support our clients in, right? So maybe we're working with someone and they want to legally transition and they just need a little bit of support to be able to do that. And so we can as part of our legal advocacy, we can help them with that process, right? We can do research into what that process looks like for them, and kind of assist them the way that we do with other legal issues when we're providing legal advocacy. Another vocabulary word to be aware of is gender affirming. So gender affirming is when someone engages in behaviors or changes to validate or uplift their gender, right? And I also want to stress that just because if someone's not engaging in gender affirming behaviors, that does not mean their gender is not valid. Gender affirming is just the appropriate term to use. There's been many different terms over the years that are no longer considered appropriate to use. So gender affirming is the appropriate term to use when we're talking about things related to transition. Again, it's really important to keep in mind that transitioning is different for everyone and that it's not linear, right? There's not necessarily an end point. Some people, they may want to transition until they consider themselves to be passing, right? And so passing would just mean like people don't assume that they are transgender. Other people, they want to never pass, right? They want to be visibly identified as someone who is not gender conforming, right? And so there may not be an end point for others. Everyone is different and everyone's experience of transitioning is going to be different. I also have another assigned male comic on the screen because I think she talks a lot about some other reasons that people may not transition. So sometimes people can't afford the cost to transition. It's a very expensive process, right? Changing legal documents can cost money. Medication and surgeries can cost money. Some people don't have the possibility to transition based on where they live and based on the laws in their area, right? Some people aren't allowed to transition. Maybe they still live with relatives who don't support them, right? Or they are afraid to be out to this person, so then they can't transition. And some aren't in a safe environment to a transition, right? There's a lot of safety considerations. And so this could also be part of safety planning when you're working with survivors. And I also want to really emphasize that no one has to conform to any specific standard to deserve respect, right? I feel like sometimes people will make different judgments based on what someone looks like, about who they are, where they are in their gender journey, their transition, what that looks like for them. People will make assumptions based on what they look like. And we really, really want to avoid doing that, especially as advocates. No one should have to pass and be assumed to not be trans to deserve our respect. Everyone should be able to show up as their whole self, and we should respect them regardless of what they look like or who they are. Okay. So now we want to move on to pronouns. So I know a couple of you have mentioned using pronouns, asking people for pronouns already today, which is great. And so I want you to answer in the chat, why are pronouns and names important? To show respect toward the other person, to identify who you are. It's a way to affirm someone's gender, sign of respect and dignity, shows acceptance, helps someone be seen, part of who they are, shows respect, honoring, validating, shows respect, lots of showing respect, which is great. Identifies who you are, shows that you care about them as a person, makes people feel like they belong, makes people feel seen. It can be triggering and traumatizing to misgender someone. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so this is great. It sounds like a lot of you all have some familiarity with pronouns and see how important they are, right? I know if someone mistakes my name, I can get upset with them, right? And I'm cis, right? So it's also just that way of showing respect, like you all mentioned. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about some gender neutral pronouns and go through what some of those look like. We're also going to talk about how to incorporate pronouns into our introduction. So you might have seen at the beginning, I said my name and my pronouns. So I always like to introduce myself that way, especially in like my professional context, because then it invites people to share their pronouns with me without me necessarily asking them to. And it also can demonstrate that I'm a safe person and I understand what pronouns are. And then it's also important to ask about pronouns. So we always want to be asking people's pronouns, especially when we're doing things like intake, because that way we will know what someone's pronouns are. And we also want to make sure we're asking everyone, right? We cannot assume that someone what someone's pronouns are without asking them, right? Because our gender expression and our gender identity are not the same thing. So someone said, how do we know we need to ask? What if they are offended? That's a great question. So definitely in your professional life, especially if you're doing intakes, intake is when you should be asking about someone's pronouns. I think you should be asking everyone, because if you're asking everyone, that means you're not assuming anyone's pronouns. If someone's offended, asking usually leads to people being less offended about their pronouns, especially if they know you're asking everyone. Sometimes people don't, when you ask someone who doesn't know what pronouns are or why you're asking, sometimes they might be offended or they just might not know what's going on. And so you can just explain to them why you're asking and just explain that you ask everyone this question and it's a common intake question. So that's how I would handle that. So that's a great question. And someone in the chat said asking is always better than offending. Yes. And then Marley shared the Forge pronoun guide. So that's got a lot of information as a fact sheet about different pronouns. Someone said in their personal life, they like to ask a person's name first and then ask if someone has a preference and they'll tell you about their pronouns. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to do another Mentimeter, and let me bring it up for us. So I just want you to list what are some pronouns that you've heard people use. They, them, she, him, her, they. Awesome. These great. Yeah, it sounds like some of you are pretty familiar with some pronouns already. Names only, yeah. So yes, these are all great. So thank you all for sharing some of these pronouns. One I see on the screen is it. And I know I've definitely met some folks who use it as a pronoun because they're reclaiming it because it's been used against them harmfully. And so I've definitely seen that. But we also do want to make sure we're not using that as a pronoun for someone unless they specifically tell us to. Lots of gender neutral pronouns on here, so we're going to go through some of those. And then another thing that I've seen here is strict name calling only. So this is when someone prefers just to use their name and not use any pronouns. And I also have met folks who've done that. Awesome, thank you all. So Marley already shared in the chat a handout, and it goes through some of these as well. But so some common pronouns that you're all familiar with is she, her, hers, he, him, his, right? Those are what we would consider the binary pronouns. There's they, them, theirs as a gender neutral pronoun. And the zir, zers, or here, hers, as another form of a gender neutral or non-binary pronoun. There's many more, and I think the handout Marley shared has a few more as well as how to pronounce them, because sometimes we might not know how to pronounce them unless we've heard them aloud before. And I also saw someone in the chat saying that they have a really hard time using they, them pronouns for singular person because it sounds weird and uncomfortable. And so that's a really great point. And so I actually have some tips on how to practice that. So one way that I have practiced that is just trying to switch, like in my head, trying to just default to they, them all the time, unless I specifically know someone's pronouns. So I will always try to default to they, them pronouns when I meet a new person, or when I'm referring to someone who I don't know how they, what pronouns they use. And so that's one way I practice. And just another way to practice is like get with a buddy and practice having a conversation and using they, them pronouns only. When I do this training in person, I do have a practice, like a small group activity that I like to do where I kind of recreate that, but unfortunately we couldn't do that today because of the virtual training. So yeah, so I'm seeing quite a few questions come into the comment or into the Q&A. So give me 1 second to pause and look at them. Yeah, so someone asked, what's the proper way to ask someone how they identify? This is a question I need to ask during intakes I conduct, but I become awkward when asking it. Great question. We're going to talk more about intakes tomorrow as well. But what I would say is keep it open-ended. So like if you're doing like you know how you have to collect data for your grant sometimes, you can rephrase those questions so they're just open-ended questions. And like fill in the blank questions. And so people can say whatever they want. And then if you need to clarify it for your grant reporting, then you can follow up and ask them if they have a preference of how you would like them to, how they would like you to record this. When you do it in intake, I think there's a difference between asking someone those questions and what you need to for your grant reporting. Making sure that you have those as kind of separate topics is really important. And so I just like to introduce myself with my pronouns and ask their name and pronouns. That kind of makes it a little less awkward. We also don't need to know how they identify. We don't need to know their specific identity unless they want to share it with us. And you could always ask an open-ended question about, is there anything about your identity that you would like to share with me so that I can better provide services to you? Something like that. But we don't necessarily need to know their gender identity or any other identity for that matter that they may hold unless they think it's relevant for us to provide services. Another question I'm seeing is, what is zir? So zir, so the last line, these are just other pronouns that people may use. And so I just have this on here so that in case you come across someone who uses those pronouns, that you're like, oh, I know what this is a pronoun, and that you feel a little more comfortable using it. And then, is there a chance that asking someone's pronouns could trigger gender dysphoria? That's a great question. And I'm not sure. I think that asking someone's pronouns is always going to be better than not asking someone's pronouns, because assuming someone's pronouns can absolutely trigger gender dysphoria. And so asking can be a little bit more harm reduction. So if I think it's less likely to be triggering than assuming someone's pronouns, right? But that could be also very, the things that trigger someone's gender dysphoria can be very personal. And so I'm not sure. For some people, it may trigger their gender dysphoria, but I still think it's always better to ask. Thank you for the great questions, everyone. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about they as a singular pronoun, because something that I hear pretty frequently when I've given this training in the past is that it's a new pronoun, people aren't sure how to use it. But I also want to remind us that we've actually used they as a singular pronoun for like hundreds of years now. So the first use of they as a singular pronoun was in 1375, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. Shakespeare's used it, Jane Austen's used it, Emily Dickinson has used it. And so really, I think the biggest shift is that we need to just get more comfortable using it in our everyday speech. And like, I know when I was a kid, my English teacher was like, never use they, them pronouns for singular use. Always say he or she. And so I had to unlearn that practice in my brain and in my writing, right? I just had to be like, no, this is actually the correct way to do it, is to say they. And now when I see he or she in like a writing document, I kind of am like, oh, that like they need to change this. So what do we do? What do we do when we mess up someone's pronouns? I know a lot of folks were talking at the beginning about being concerned about making mistakes, messing up, that sort of thing. So what do we do? So we can react like this. Sorry, I didn't mean to, right? And then we can move on, right? We don't want to overreact, right? We don't want to deny what we said, like, no, I didn't do that. Because you probably did. So we don't want to deny it. We want to take accountability. We don't want to overreact and be like, oh my God, I'm a terrible person, I'm so sorry. Because that's not helpful either. And we also don't want to say, oh, it's too hard. Like, this is just hard, I'm not going to do it. Because when we say that, that means we don't care about someone enough as a person to make an effort, right? So we always want to be making an effort. And it is hard sometimes. Sometimes it takes a little bit to switch up our pronouns, switch up the pronouns in our brain and how we use them. But someone made the point in the chat, once you start using them, it becomes more natural and your brain will adjust. And that's absolutely true. Okay, so let's look at the gender unicorn and how we've done so far. So we've gone through gender identity. And so this was meant to be filled out as a worksheet. So I went out and filled it out for an imaginary person. So we've learned about gender identity, and this imaginary person identifies as a woman. They don't identify at all with men or with other genders. Their gender expression looks pretty feminine, maybe a little bit masculine, but not very masculine, maybe a little bit other, right? Other genders, or maybe androgynous, right? And then their sex assigned at birth is female. So what we can see from this is this person is a cisgender woman, right? And they seem to be a little bit more feminine in their gender expression. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. So that is sexual and romantic orientations. So a sexual orientation is about who we are physically and sexually attracted to. And a romantic orientation is about who we are emotionally and romantically attracted to. And you know, I forgot to put these on clicks. I was going to ask for you all to tell me some different sexual orientations you'd heard, but I forgot to put them on clicks, so sorry about that. So I'll just go through some of these. And now you may have also heard some others that aren't on the screen. That's okay. These are just kind of some of the more, the ones that you might hear more often. So of course, there is lesbian and gay. So lesbian is a woman who is attracted to other women exclusively. Gay is someone who is attracted to the same gender as themselves. Could be for men or women. Some non-binary people also use the term gay. Bisexual, pansexual, asexual, I'm going to get into a little bit more. And then straight, of course. So someone who is attracted to, I say, quote unquote, the opposite gender, right? But we know there's no such thing as an opposite gender because there's more than two genders. And then romantic orientation is about who we are emotionally and romantically attached to. And so some that I have on here is homoromantic, biromantic, panromantic, aromantic, and heteroromantic. And yeah, so I see someone said, I don't understand the difference between the two. So yeah, so the sexual orientation is about sexual attraction and the romantic orientation is about romantic attraction. And for some people, that doesn't always line up. And so I know some bisexual people who are homoromantic. So they really only fall in love with someone who is like the same gender as them, but they're sexually attracted to all genders or many genders, right? So that's kind of the difference between the two. Some people, they often will line up. So someone who is a lesbian most likely is homoromantic. Um, and someone who's bisexual may also be biromantic or panromantic, but they don't always line up. So I know a lot of asexual folks who are homoromantic or panromantic or heteroromantic, but I also know people who are gay and aromantic, right? So I know I haven't described what those are, so I'm going to do that on the next slide. So asexual is someone who does not experience sexual attraction, and aromantic is someone who does not experience romantic attraction. Just because someone is asexual does not mean that they don't experience romantic attraction. Some people may identify as asexual and as aromantic, right? It's going to vary person by person. I also wanted to highlight bisexual folks. And I have the term bi plus up here because bi and bisexual is kind of an umbrella term for people who experience sexual and or emotional attraction to more than one gender, right? And bi plus I use because there are so many different sexual orientations that are incorporated under this, including bisexual, pansexual, fluid, and more. So there's quite a few out there. And oftentimes the reason someone chooses a particular identity word is because that's what feels right for them, right? And that it's important for us to respect that. Any other questions about the sexual or romantic orientation or any of the terms on the screen here? Okay. I feel like I went through it very quickly. So yeah. Yeah, so someone said, can you talk more about biphobia and the bi versus pan debate? Yeah, so biphobia is when someone experiences discrimination because of for being bisexual, right? It's like the fear or hatred of bi people. The bi versus pan debate, I don't think we have time to really talk about. I would be glad to talk to you about it more. If you want to send me an email, I think that's great. But really, I think there's a lot of biphobia that both the pan and bi community experience. And one thing that can happen when people experience oppression is that we might feel like we need to compete with each other or argue with each other when really we're both experiencing bi and panphobia. And I don't really find the pan versus bi debate helpful because we're experiencing very similar problems and very similar issues, and we're often grouped together, right? And I also think it can be helpful for us to be grouped together sometimes. And so there's a lot more to it, but I'd love to have a conversation with you about it if you want to send me an email after today's training. Okay, so now we're back to our imaginary person. So this imaginary person, she is physically attracted a little bit to women, a little bit more to men, and also a little bit to other genders. She's emotionally attracted to women, quite a lot, a little bit less to men, and quite a bit to other genders, right? So we can see here that maybe this person identifies, she might identify as bisexual, she might identify as pansexual. She also might identify as asexual because her physical attraction or that sexual attraction piece is a little bit lower, right, than her emotional attraction. So that might be something that she identifies with. She might identify with some of the other terms that we didn't go over today, right? But we can see how this is where someone might identify with things that don't fully, that like their physical attraction and their emotional attraction don't fully line up, right? All right, so now we're gonna watch a video. And in this video, some non-binary folks are gonna be talking about their experience.
Gender to me is a bit like languages and money, and that it exists, like it's real, and it informs how humans interact with each other a great deal, and it's important, but we made it up.
Yes.
Right. If you took your body away, who would you be at your core?
Right. Yeah.
If I didn't have this body, if I was just floating meaninglessly in space as a weird blob of cells, like who would I be inside?
Sounds lovely.
Doesn't it sound incredible?
I have like something of a reputation of being like the person that people talk to about gender at house parties. So whenever that happens, like if I'm talking to a cis man, I'm like, if you shut your eyes and try to describe to me what it means to be a man, what would you say to me? What does your gender mean to you? How would you articulate that?
People think of gender as a finite and an objective thing, that it starts here and it ends here, that you go from one place to another, and it's not that. It, for me, just keeps going. It's a continuing line. It's just walking straight in the woods and not really knowing where I'm going.
I think a lot of people kind of balk at that a little bit because they fear that it invalidates their experience of gender, whether we're talking about someone who's trans, someone who's cis, but someone who is like, but does that mean that my experience of gender isn't real? And I'm like, no, not at all, not at all. Doesn't mean that at all.
People see non-binary folks oftentimes from a binary lens. So it's almost as though, oh, you're non-binary, so are you like 50-50 male, female? And I'm like, that does not make sense.
Like, what's your ratio?
What is your ratio? Like,
Where do you fall
where
on
do you
the scale?
fall?
Yeah. The universe of gender is a bit more complicated, and let's talk about that.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in high school and I first started kind of understanding that my gender was a little more complicated than I knew how to give it credit for. I made up my own language.
Did you really?
Yeah, and the term that I used, because we were reading like a lot of Thoreau, I started using the term gender transcendentalist. Right? They're like, I practice gender transcendentalism.
So we're gonna make it happen.
Yeah,
That's
right.
gonna be the new term.
Right.
Welcome to Netflix's gender transcendentalism.
Yeah.
My gender identity does not relate to my sexual orientation even remotely. I identify as both non-binary and pansexual, which are two very fancy ways of saying I don't care. I see through you into your soul. Like, that's what matters to me, is can we talk like people? Do you understand me as a person? Can you give me what I need as a person, as a soul? Like, that's what's important to me. It doesn't matter what's in your pants. It doesn't matter how you express yourself or what you look like. It's the core of your being. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
The word and the place that I am most at home is in calling myself a lesbian, and that took a long time. I don't identify as a woman, but I'm assigned female at birth. I am looked at as a woman, I am spoken to as a woman, I am treated as a woman, and I'm attracted to women. So it's like, what am I supposed to call myself? What should I do here?
And that's why when people say, what's your sexual orientation? I'm just like, queer, pansexual's fine, I guess. I feel sexy in my gender, and I want to feel more desirable in my gender. And I think I live in a world where being femme means feeling less desirable and means feeling less beautiful. The amount of dating that I've done in my life is a lot less than people would assume. You know, because I'm desexualized everywhere I go.
Yeah.
There's a time in my life when I thought I can be with someone who is, if they're just attracted to me when I'm in gym shorts and a t-shirt, I can live with it. And now I'm in a place where I'm like, no, you don't get that pass anymore. I need you to see me in a dress and understand me as beautiful.
Just finding someone who'd be willing to look past the exterior and see you for yourself.
Oh, but also love the exterior.
Of course. I mean, it comes with the package. It's the whole package.
Growing up, people are like, where did you see yourself in media? And they want me to say like David Bowie. And I'm like, no. It was Gandalf, okay? We already have trans feminine people who are heroes in our folklore.
Yes, we do.
Like, it's just that we don't name it or allow them to have real story.
We code it.
Yes.
Queer characters are very often stereotyped as villains, caricatures, sidekicks are there for comic relief, or they don't serve the narrative a greater purpose.
What I want to say to every producer in Hollywood is just, you have a blank slate every time.
Right.
Why would you create a new world and give it the same limitations as the old one?
Right.
Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you write a fantasy, but like homophobia still exists in like your made up universe?
Exactly.
Why?
I got cast in Sabrina, and they put in the end of the email, if you want to share your story, your journey, we'd love to hear it. I said, yeah, fuck yeah, here you go. Here's all the trauma in my life that has prepared me for this moment in particular. Here's all the shit I can talk about. We're telling a queer storyline, but we're telling it right because they're listening to me. What I wish people knew about non-binary identity is I think that we're equal people, that we don't have to be different if you don't see us that way, that we are human and that our ideas and our concepts and our feelings are human and that we just want to be accepted and loved just like everyone else.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So I see someone asked to share the link. Marley, if I gave you the link, can you share it in the chat for us? If not, I will, I'll look it up and share it with you all at the end of the presentation today. So yeah, so I think I really like showing this video because I feel like they have a very interesting conversation about what gender means to each of them. And it means something different to all of them, right? So it's really important to acknowledge and recognize that everyone's experience is unique and different. And that there's a lot of different ways that people refer to themselves, and that is valid. Okay, so we're almost done. And so I really quickly want to have what I'm going to call a pop quiz. And so I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all of them, depending on the timing. But I just want us to kind of go through some different gender unicorns, and see if we kind of remember some of the stuff that we talked about today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some different identities of how someone has, like, an imaginary person has completed this worksheet. And like, let's think about how some of those terms that we went over may apply to them. And I really emphasize may apply because we can't know what identity term someone uses unless they tell us, right? But we may have a general sense of what their identity is based on how they fill out this form, for example. Right, so this person, their gender identity is female, their gender expression is feminine, and they are sex assigned male at birth. So if you want to put in the chat, what do you think they may identify as? So one person said they may identify as a trans woman or as trans feminine. Absolutely, right? So those are some different identities they might hold. Let's see. I think and then we also have their physical attraction to men and emotional attraction to men. So what is their potentially their sexual orientation? Yeah, so their sexual orientation is straight, most likely, right? So because they identify as a woman and they're attracted to men, they're most likely identifying as straight. They may not, though. So like I said, we do not want to assume someone's identities, but just based on this information, that's how they may identify. Okay, so this next one is someone who identifies as a man. They express themselves in a masculine way, and their sex assigned birth is male. So they are a cis man, right? Someone just put that in the chat. And this person, they're physically attracted to women, men, and other genders, pretty high up for all of them. And they're emotionally attracted to women, men a little bit less than women, and other genders. Yeah, so some people are putting that they may identify as pansexual or bisexual. Yeah. But again, we don't want to assume that they identify as pan or that they identify as bi. I know a lot of times these identities are very personal, right? And we don't want to make assumptions. Okay. This person identifies as a woman, as their gender expression is feminine, and their sex assigned at birth is intersex. Right, so they may identify as a woman, depending on how their intersex identity was handled when they were born. They may have been assigned female at birth. They may not. We don't know from this chart, but they identify as a woman. Physically attracted to no one. and emotionally attracted to women. So they may identify as asexual, and they may identify as a lesbian. They may identify as homoromantic, right? So again, there's many, many different terms that someone may use, but I'm hoping that we feel a little bit more like we understand how some of these terms work together, right? I'm going to skip the next one because we're almost done. So I also just want to make a final note about LGBTQ communities and cultures. And for us to really keep in mind that there's no one LGBTQ community, right? There are many, many different communities. There's many subcultures that exist among people who have LGBT identities. There are different types of people. Some people, it's very important to them that their ethnic or racial heritage is included when they talk about their sexual and gender identity, right? And so there's many different ways to be LGBTQ. This can also include unique language, unique ways of communicating your identity to others in the community, and more. And we don't have time today or tomorrow really to talk about some of the cultural aspects of LGBT identity, right? There's a bunch of different things that are cultural to LGBT identities, but I do want to encourage everyone to practice cultural humility. So if you are not a part of the LGBTQ community, this is always learning, being humble in that you're not going to know everything and you're going to make mistakes, and making sure we're asking respectful questions of people. It also means that if we are within the community, that we are also doing the same things, right? Because I, as a cisgender bisexual woman, cannot represent the entire LGBTQ community, and I cannot know the entire LGBTQ community. And there may be people who hold different identities than me, who thought I did a really great job on this training, that I really, when I talked about their community, I talked about it really well, and other people who feel I made mistakes, and that's okay. And if I made mistakes, I would love for you to let me know, because I'm always trying to improve these trainings as well. And like I said, I can't represent the entire community. So that is what we have for you today. Please come back tomorrow. It's the same time, 12:30 p.m. tomorrow. For the second half, when we're going to talk about barriers and best practices to serving LGBTQ survivors. So hopefully everyone will be on the same page with the language and we'll know what's going on. But for now, Marley's going to put the evaluation in the chat. Please complete the evaluation. And once you have completed the evaluation, at the end of it, there'll be a thing that says, click here to get your certificate, and click here to download the slides. And so please click those links, get your certificate, get those slides. And then the certificate and slides will be available for 2 weeks after the training. I also want to plug, so at ACES DV, I am one of the co-chairs for the Rainbow Collective, which is the LGBTQ committee. So if you're interested in joining the committee, we work to help programs improve their response to LGBT survivors across Arizona. So if you want to be in the committee, please let me know. Please send me an email. Also, if you have any questions or you want to talk more about some of the things that were discussed today, please send me an email. I would love to set up a time to chat. And then tomorrow we'll also answer that one question about the support group that we didn't have time for today. All right, so please go ahead and complete the survey. And then once you've done that, you can feel free to hop off the call today. And thank you everyone for coming.